We are gathered today, Motzei, the observance of HaAtzma'ut, and the results of the survey were that we'll be speaking about Shivchei Eretz Yisra'el. And I'd specifically like to embark on the passage in Sefer HaKuzari that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi explicitly designates for discussing ma'alata, the virtues of Eretz Yisrael, which might, we would think, invite a discussion of various conceptual superlatives, especially in what is, after all, not a Sefer Halacha predominantly, but rather a Sefer Hagud, even though the Siman immediately preceding, Ma'amar Sheni, Siman Kaf, is entirely halachic, and indeed excruciatingly so, on the subject of the international dateline, which maybe we'll take the opportunity to discuss sometime in the future, but not now. What Rabbi Yehuda Halevi tells us at the beginning of this discussion of Ma'alata, the virtues of Eretz Yisrael, is, I wouldn't merely say exclusively, but excruciatingly, one of halachic priorities. And maybe before we begin, I feel compelled just to place matters, at least briefly, in context that is perhaps particularly germane in the circumstances that we are experiencing this year. I remember at the time of the first wave of pogroms here, recent memory, that is the pogroms that became known as the First Intifada. I made the comment that if it were anywhere else in the world, we should see the writing on the wall and run for our lives. We've had enough experiences in the not terribly distant past to appreciate the extent to which things can really spiral very dangerously out of control, as indeed they are today in much of the world, certainly in the United States. Except we don't have any place to run to, because this is the place that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us to be, which on the most essential plane is, I think, the most crucial verity for us to bear in mind in considering the significance of Eretz Yisrael. And in this way, I completely agree with the comment that we shouldn't be discussing merely a halachic prioritization. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us He wants us to be here. The whole game plan from the get-go, from the sneh, explicitly, isn't just that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to bring us up me'oni Mitzrayim, but to bring us to Eretz Tova Urechava, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, reiterated at the beginning of Parashat Va'era, where it isn't merely V'hotzeti, V'yitzalti, V'laga'alti, V'lakachti, but V'aveti etchem el ha'aretz asher nasati et adi latet otah Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, V'natati otah lachem morashani Hashem. Not merely saving us from Egypt, but bringing us to Eretz Yisrael. And this verity, the centrality of Eretz Yisrael, just noting in passing the comment of Ramban in Devarim, Perek Dalet Pasuk Hey, La'asot ken bekerev ha'aretz. The entire Torah is intended for La'asot ken bekerev ha'aretz, which is an idea that Ramban develops on manifold planes. We're not discussing Ramban right now, but that reality, the centrality of Eretz Yisrael, is something that certainly needs to be on our radar screen, central on our radar screen, as not merely the place in which we fulfill the Torah, but the place through which we fulfill the Torah. And it doesn't only apply to those mitzvot that are mitzvot atluyot ba'aretz. Of course, this is something that Ramban discusses at length in his commentary on Parashat Vayam Shema. Well, again, we're not discussing that right now. But rather, something that informs the identity of all of the Torah and everything that we are summoned to do as an expression of our fidelity to the Torah. So, of course, it's critical for us to bear that in mind. And yet, at the same time, the subject of mitzvat Yishuv Eretz Yisra'el is one that I think it's important for us to address for our own lives. I hope to impact on those who are not yet fulfilling this central imperative. And in particular, in the context of discussing not only Sefer HaKuzari, but altogether the discussion of mitzvat Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, specifically in the period of the Rishonim. There is a dimension that I think needs to be borne in mind. And because this is something of, I think, an enigma in our own minds, one considers the gamut of literature in the period of the Rishonim that pertains to Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And from Rabbeinu Chaim and the Tosfot, presuming that this Rabbeinu Chaim is authentic and not a forgery, which Maharit says it is, whatever, to the position among the Rishonim that Mitzvah Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael is an absolute categorical imperative, a mitzvah chiyuvit, no matter where in the world you are. Whose shita is that? Rabbi Levi. It might be Ramban's shita. Not so much when it's Ramban's shita. But there is such a broad gamut of positions on the subject of Mitzvah Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael, and it's important for us in embarking upon this journey to place matters, I think, on some plane in historical context. And that is, I'll just note, not that I consider this piece of literature in any way, shape, or form an authority, but in Encyclopedia Judaica, in the entry on those who came to Eretz Yisrael, especially significant figures who came to Eretz Yisrael, the first name on the list, obviously, this is presumptively a list of rabbinical figures, is Rabbi Yehuda Levi. And it's important for us to consider the extent to which Rabbi Yehuda Levi is coming to Eretz Yisrael. Thanks to the Cairo Gniza, we can no longer indulge in mere conjecture as to whether he came to Eretz Yisrael. We know he did. We even know exactly when. That is, the ship that would bring him to Eretz Yisrael set sail from the port in Alexandria on the first day of Shavuot, the Minyanam 1141, which means by all presumption that within 10 days he would have been in Eretz Yisrael. Unfortunately, he was only here approximately 2 months before his evidently sudden death. But that's not a subject for discussion right now. My point is simply this. When Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135, Leminyanam. Rabbi Yehuda Levi comes to Eretz Yisrael almost exactly a millennium afterward. And what happened in the intervening millennium? Almost nothing. That is important for us to bear in mind. I'm focusing in particular upon the Bar Kokhba revolt because, unlike the Babylonians, the Romans did not have some categorical policy of exiling the inhabitants of a conquered country. The Babylonians, like the Assyrians, had a determined policy of exile. The Romans did not. The overwhelming majority of the Jews who were in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Churban remained in Eretz Yisrael. Granted, the Romans may have decimated the population of Yerushalayim and its environs to the tune of well over 1 million people, and taken incalculable numbers to be sold in the slave markets of Rome. But most of Am Yisrael remained in Eretz Yisrael. I should say not most, but most of those who were in Eretz Yisrael remained in Eretz Yisrael, because the truth of the matter is that in the entire period of Bayit Sheni, at the zenith of the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, there was a plurality of Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, never a majority. Which is why, of course, in the discussion of Shemitah v'Yovel being the Oraita, with the condition of Ukratem Doror Ba'aretz L'chol Yosheveha, the translation on the Liberty Bell, for those who are familiar with what the Liberty Bell means: proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. All the inhabitants. Well, all, of course, means most, because Acharei Rabim Lahatot, we already know that Rov is Kol. If most of the inhabitants are not in Eretz Yisrael, then Yovel evaporates, and if Yovel evaporates, then Shemitah also evaporates, except Chazal instituted Shemitah d'Rabbanan. But that means that the entire period of Bayit Sheni, there wasn't any Shemitah d'Oraita, there wasn't any Yovel at all, they weren't counting Yovel at all. Am Yisrael predominantly remained outside of Eretz Yisrael, which is, of course, something that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi addresses at length, as does manifestly the Gemara, famously in Masechet Yoma Daf Bet Amud Bet, the words of Reish Lakish. We won't get into that right now. Also, it's something that pertains to a different shiur, a different subject. But again, after the Churban, most of those who were in Eretz Yisrael remained. Eretz Yisrael became a land of emigration, of devastating immigration. After the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Romans reached the conclusion that what made this people so utterly intractable to being dominated was their Torah, and therefore the way to control the Jews was to eradicate the Torah. And thus begin all of the Hadrianic decrees that are intended to stamp out Torah, and it becomes almost impossible to live as a Jew in Eretz Yisrael, whereupon, again, Eretz Yisrael becomes devastatingly a land of immigration, and so it essentially remained for 1 millennium, until finally the Jews started to come back. And Rabbi Yehuda is a crucial bridge figure in that regard. Where we were having Sudat Leil Shabbat this past Shabbat, the children had decided to give a chidon for the guests, and one of the subjects was HaAtzma'ut, and one of the questions in the chidon was, who's the founder of Zionism? And my response was, I know the answer that you want, but the correct answer is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Sorry? So we're talking about the modern Zionist movement. The modern Zionist movement of getting the Jews to move back to Eretz Yisrael.
Also said the people. We don't go to be a person, especially in this context.
Okay. Thank you. But in any case, Le'inyanenu, I simply note that the subject of Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael wasn't on the radar screen. For a whole millennium, it wasn't on the radar screen. So if we ask, how could there be such extraordinary diversity of views with respect to the status of this mitzvah? The answer very simply is, it wasn't practicable. Not just it wasn't practiced, it wasn't practicable. Eretz Yisrael was off the charts. And whatever was known in the time of Chazal with respect to mitzvah Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael was simply no longer a living memory. So of course we have the sources in Chazal, but that they don't unimpeachably tell us what the status of this mitzvah is. And that's part of the problem. The additional dimension, and this is inevitably what we're going to see in the discussion of the Ma'alot of Eretz Yisrael in the passage before us, the additional dimension is considering as a matter of practicality just what the significance of Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael is. And without any further ado, I'd like to launch into the passage that we're discussing. That is, merely place matters in context. The top line on the first page here is the last line of Ma'amar Sheni, second treatise of Sefer HaKuzari, Siman Kaf. This is the last line of a rather long and complex Siman, whose subject, as I already noted, is the international dateline. And why we regard the sanctification of time as inextricably linked to and dependent upon the sanctification of space, specifically Yerushalayim. What's germane for our purposes, again, this final line, what Rabotenu say regarding the virtues of Eretz Yisrael, it's a long story. And the king responds very tersely, so tell me a little bit about what comes to mind. Of course, we note that in as much as Sefer HaKuzari, this also is clearly established from Rabbi Yehuda Levi's correspondence with his friend and patron Rabbi Chalfon HaLevi in the Cairo Geniza, is a complete fabrication. There was no existing manuscript or existing dialogue. Rabbi Yehuda Levi is writing both voices here. Of course, the king says, "Mashi izdamen lecha." What happens to occur to you? But obviously, Rabbi Yehuda Levi's response is very much determined by his own agenda. And to that extent, let's just consider very briefly what he has to tell us with respect to the Ma'alot of Eretz Yisrael in the opening part of this Siman. And I freely concede that opening in context here is a reflection of my own desire to take relatively lengthy and complex passages and divide them into paragraphs. So this is, in my reckoning, the first paragraph of Siman Kafbet. And has he begin? Mima she'amru ve'inyan zeh, hakol ma'alin le'eretz Yisrael ve'en hakol motzi'in. In the girsa that he uses, moridin, the lashon of the final Mishnah in Masechet Ketubot. And of what significance is this in his portrayal of Ma'alot Eretz Yisrael? In short, that Eretz Yisrael is grounds for divorce. ודנו האישה שאינה רוצה לעלות עם בעלה לארץ ישראל, תצא בלא כתובה והופכו, כאשר האיש אינו רוצה לעלות עם אשתו לארץ ישראל יוציא וייתן כתובה. If one spouse wants to come to Eretz Yisrael and the other does not, that's grounds for forcing the recalcitrant spouse either to come on Aliyah nevertheless, or to bear sole financial responsibility for the dissolution of the marriage that will then ensue. And the second aspect of Ma'alot Eretz Yisrael, ve'amru le'olam yadur adam be'eretz Yisrael, ve'afilu ve'ir sheruba goyim, ve'al yadur bechutz ha'aretz, ve'afilu be'ir sheruba Yisrael. שכל אדם בארץ ישראל דומה למי שיש לו אלוה, וכל אדם בחוץ לארץ דומה למי שאין לו אלוה. The second din is that a person should give preference to dwelling in Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is predominantly Gentile, and not outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is predominantly Jewish, because if you dwell in Eretz Yisrael, then you resemble one who has a God, and if you dwell outside of Eretz Yisrael, you resemble one who has no God. And while he doesn't quote the entire text of the Gemara in this regard. As the Gemara says, what it really doesn't have a god. Everyone has a god, okay, but he resembles an idolater. Says the Gemara. B'chein b'Davidu Omer ki gershuna yom yistapech b'nachalat Hashem le'mor lech avod Elohim acherim. And the proof text, we'll see the source of this in the manner in which Chazal are doresh this pasuk, that when David is protesting to Shaul against the fact that Shaul is pursuing him and trying to kill him, so he speaks of those who have badmouthed him to Shaul as accursed because they have banished me this day from basking in the divine heritage, saying, go worship other gods. And of course, the inevitable question that the Gemara asks, Rabbi Levi quotes the text in an abridged form, whoever told David to engage in idolatry, that is, that he had to flee from Eretz Yisrael, that we understand, but what that has to do with idolatry? Indeed, when one lives outside of Eretz Yisrael, that in itself is tantamount to being reckoned an idolater. Then there's an additional dimension that Rabbi Levi discusses with respect to the land of Egypt. I don't think we're going to have time to discuss this evening. So for all intents and purposes, Rabbi Levi begins with two explicitly halachic statements. One, that Eretz Yisrael is grounds for divorce. The other, that the preference for living in Eretz Yisrael trumps the extent to which one should want to live in a place of Torah, in a place that is predominantly Jewish. Now, inevitably, in order to place matters in a broader context here, what we should be considering is the sources for Rabbi Levi's statement here. So, to go through this fairly tersely, because I realize our time is limited, we note first the verse from Parashat Behar, Ani Hashem Elokechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, latet lachem et Eretz Canaan lichot lachem le'elokim. And of course, one notes the juxtaposition here. Latet lachem et Eretz Canaan. The reason, implicitly, that I am giving you Eretz Canaan, the land of Israel, is lichot lachem le'elokim, in order to be your God. And the first source that we discuss in this regard is the Sifra on this verse, Midrash Halacha, Mikan Amru, Kol Ben Yisrael Yoshev Be'eretz Yisrael, Mekabel Alav Ol Malchut Shamayim, V'chol Yotzeh Lechutz La'aretz, Ki'ilu Oved Avodat Elilim. Now, this is the Sifra. Again, Midrash Halacha, Midrash Tanaim. This is, if you will, the first stratum of written compendium of Torah Shebe'al Peh. And indeed, the drash that Rabbi Levi cited with respect to David is explicitly cited in the Sifra as well, again referring to those who have badmouthed him to Shaul, a slightly different question than the one that we find in the Gemara, but nonetheless, substantively, it amounts to the same thing. What is the banishment from Eretz Yisrael to do with being an idolater? You leave Eretz Yisrael, that's considered tantamount to idolatry. The additional dimension that we'll note before moving on to the Tosefta is another statement that we find, if you will, wedded to the text, this in the Sifrei, the psukim from Parashat Re'eh. Ostensibly, the focus of the Sifrei is on the second of these psukim, but we find two psukim that are in broad outline enunciating the same principle, practically back to back, in Parashat Re'eh, in Devarim, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, V'yirishtem otah v'yishavtem ba, in Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Kaftet, V'yarashta otam v'yashavta be'artzam. But they both amount essentially to the same principle. This is expressed as an imperative. Now, of course, one could argue these psukim are an imperative for whom? in context, of course, we can understand them as an imperative for Bnei Yisrael, poised to enter Eretz Yisrael. The command, after all, pertains explicitly in the former pasuk to Ki atem ovrim et hayarden lavo lareshet et haaretz. You're passing over the Yarden to possess the land. The second of these psukim again speaks of the nations whom you are inheriting, dispossessing, again referring to the agenda that stands before Bnei Yisrael entering into Eretz Yisrael. And yet, when one considers the manner in which this pasuk is expounded in the Sefer, and here inevitably we bear in mind what I noted a few minutes ago with respect to the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Yashavta be'artzam, the Sifrei is Doresh. There are two anecdotes that both convey the same message. Maaseh beRabbi Yehuda ben Petera beRabbi Matya ben Charash beRabbi Chanina ben Achi Rabbi Yoshua beRabbi Yonatan שהיו יוצאים חוץ לארץ והגיעו לפלטום, מקום בחוץ לארץ, וזכרו את ארץ ישראל, זקפו עיניהם וזלגו לדמעותיהם וקראו בגדיהם וקראו המקרא הזה וירשת אותם וישבת בארצם וחזרו ובאו למקומם אמרו ישיבת ארץ ישראל שקולה כנגד כל מצוות שבת תורה. Understand the context here. So you have these rabbanim and they're leaving Eretz Yisrael. They're going to Chutz La'aretz. Why are they leaving Eretz Yisrael? Again, we're talking about the period of the Hadrianic decrees and the intolerable situation that existed in Eretz Yisrael. So on the one hand, they're leaving Eretz Yisrael in order to be able to fulfill the Torah. And they reach the first outpost in Chutz La'aretz, Paltum, and they remember Eretz Yisrael. And the Midrash expresses it. They lifted up their eyes and the tears ran down and they rent their clothing and recited this pasuk. You will take possession of them, that is the nations that are living in the land, and dwell in their land. And they couldn't leave. They went back. And the critical importance of the statement that they make, Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael shkula keneged kol mitzvot shebat Torah, first of all enunciates that's a mitzvah. That is, manifestly, the fact that it is a mitzvah is clear in as much as it is being ranked as of commensurate importance to all the mitzvot of the Torah. But the first enunciation here on the most basic plane, that indeed, this is a mitzvah. And the same emerges from the anecdote that follows. Now, ironically, this is coming from a generation later. You see the list of Talmidim here. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua and Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar are disciples of Rabbi Akiva. They're going to the Tivim, Etzel Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera lilmod himenu Torah. Now, there was more than one Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, so I'm not sure that this is Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera that we read about in the previous excerpt in the Sifrei that immediately precedes. But in any case, again, the bottom line is they're leaving Eretz Yisrael explicitly in order to learn Torah. And we reiterate, this is in the period of the Shmad, when study of Torah was a capital crime. V'yigiu l'tzaidan, again, just outside of the borders of Eretz Yisrael, v'zachru et Eretz Yisrael, zakfu einehem v'zalgu dignotehem v'kavu bigdehem. Again, the exact same expression. They lifted up their eyes, the tears ran down, they rent their clothing. We have this agenda. We have this priority of engaging in Torah, being able to study Torah. But if dwelling in Eretz Yisrael is of commensurate weight to all the mitzvot of the Torah, then we can't pass up on remaining in Eretz Yisrael. So again, this principle of the centrality of dwelling in Eretz Yisrael, of course, this is an idea that isn't only enunciated in the Midrash Halacha, it is explicit in the Tosefta in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Perek Hey. I want to stress, I'm going to say this tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless, this isn't Zionist text, this is Tosefta. Yishrei Adam בארץ ישראל אפילו בעיר שרובה עובדי כוכבים ולא בחוץ לארץ אפילו בעיר שכולה ישראל. Note here the lashon is רובה עובדי כוכבים versus כולה ישראל. Obviously, the city in Eretz Yisrael could never be kula עובדי כוכבים if you're going to live there. So it's going to be rov. But you could have a city in Chutz La'aretz that's Kula Yisra'el. I don't know, Muncie, Borough Park, whatever. They're not, but still, you could imagine. And the emphasis in the Tosefta is the priority being given to being in Eretz Yisrael. Now, why is this so important? And ultimately, how is this going to inform our understanding of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is doing? To say that something is valuable, if you don't give it a clearly quantified priority, is an utterly vacuous statement. Life is seldom, if ever, about contrasting something that is valuable with something else that is utterly worthless. Rather, you consider different things of levels of value, and you need to consider what's more valuable, what takes priority. And it is in the same vein that we appreciate what was going on in the Sefer. These Chachamim were leaving Eretz Yisrael because they wanted to either live Torah or study Torah. And the priority given to Eretz Yisrael, Shkula Yeshivat Yisrael Keneged Kol Mitzvot Shabbat Torah, is enunciating halachic prioritization. What the Tosefta is telling you explicitly about dwelling in a city that is predominantly pagan and not a city that is entirely Jewish is establishing halachic prioritization. It's in that vein, Melamed Yeshivat Yisrael Shkula Keneged Kol Mitzvot Shabbat Torah, that it is of commensurate weight to all the mitzvot. And now we continue.
Say about Torah as well, right?
Sorry?
Torah is also Keneged Kol, right?
Right.
Look,
the truth of the matter is, there are a few things that Chazal say are shkula keneged kol Torah kula. So
particularly here, right? They are Trump. They're saying that Eretz Yisrael trumps the other thing, which is also one of these things which are called Keneged.
In some plane, I will agree with you. I'm also prepared to say when Chazal used the lashon of shkula keneged kol Torah kula, on some plane we appreciate it's a hyperbolic statement, but it still isn't something they say about everything. Yeah. That is, unequivocally, it is establishing the centrality of the subject at hand, and that definitely is what's taking place here. And likewise, what follows? Lo yitzeh adam lechutz la'aretz ela im ken hayu chitim sa'atayim b'sela. Now, obviously, in order to appreciate what the significance of chitim sa'atayim b'sela, that 2 se'ah of wheat cost a sela, only is meaningful if you have a basis for comparison. So we'll just note that it emerges in Rambam. This is the subject of the bracketed insert that I placed following this, that is twice the normal price. Twice the normal price, with the implication being that there isn't enough food to go around. That's simply an inflationary spiral. How do I know that? Because of the continuation. The continuation of the Tosefta, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Bamed Dvarim Amorim, Bizman she'eno motze likach. Aval bizman she'lo motze likach, afilu se'ah b'sela lo yitzeh. That is, eno motze likach means he doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to get food. Of course, this also pertains to halachic priorities. That the Gemara, after all, famously tells us that that to depend upon a handout from others is so terrible a situation that one should veritably be reducing one's celebration of Shabbat to a normal weekday. Obviously, the person doesn't have anything to eat at all. That's a different story. But that would be a consideration if you can't afford to leave Eretz Yisrael. If it's simply a matter of an inflationary spiral, then even if the normal price is quadrupled, it's just an inflationary spiral. I guess we would call that triple-digit inflation, because if it's quadrupled, that means you're talking about 400% inflation. Okay, that's the level at which one is permitted to leave. And then Rabbi Shimon goes on to make an additional statement. And that is, and even permitted does not mean advised. Rabbi Shimon אומר, אלימלך מגדולי הדור מפרנסי ציבור היה, על שיצא לחוץ לארץ מת הוא ובניו ברעב. Now, the implication, of course, in context is that he was leaving with halachic sanction because it was a ra'av. Because indeed, this criterion had been met. And yet, because of having left Eretz Yisrael, when we read these words in Megillat Ruth, that Ayamot Elimelech Ish Naomi, the Gemara is telling you he died because of leaving Eretz Yisrael. When Naomi comes back, the whole city is still around to be dismayed at her return. Everyone else remained alive, and he died, not only died, but died by reason of famine outside of Eretz Israel. And the drashot continue. I think because of a limited time, going through them in detail is not indicated. We don't have the time to go into them in detail. One is certainly welcome to see these on one's own, but the thrust of it is always, in every instance, the extent to which having the connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu depends upon being in Eretz Yisrael. Beginning, of course, the second drash here is Latet Lachem et Eretz Canaan, Lihyot Lachem Elokim, which we already saw in the Sifra. We won't go through all of the various drashot, but of course the thrust of them, again, is the extent to which living in Eretz Yisrael is such a considerable priority. I'll just conclude with, on a somewhat different plane, the concluding lines in the Tosefta. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Yisrael shebechutz la'aretz ovdei avodat kochavim betaharahen, which one can only read as a tongue-in-cheek statement that when Yisrael is outside of Eretz, so they're considered idolaters, but they're doing it in purity, meaning HaKuzari עובד כוכבים שעשה משתה לבנו והלך וזימן כל היהודים שבעירו, אף על פי שהם אוכלים משלהם ושותים משלהם ושמה שלהם עומד על גביהם, עובדי עבודת כוכבים הם שנאמר וקרא לך ואכלת מזבחו. Which I will read on the most basic plane as, you can be keeping all the mitzvahs, but you are subordinate to a pagan culture. And if you're subordinate to a pagan culture, you're subordinated to it. You indeed imbibe of that pagan culture, and you're considered on some plane to be an idolater. And I'll just note here that perhaps the best raya for that is in Onkelos. Va'avadetem sham Elohim ma'aseh yedei adam eitz va'aven. And how does Onkelos translate that? Are you really going to be engaging in idolatry because you're outside of Eretz Yisrael? V'tiflechun taman le'amemaya al chet avata ovad enasha a'a ve'avna. You will be serving their people who serve gods that are the handiwork of man, wood and stone. That is, you're not necessarily going to become an idolater in the literal sense. You're considered like an idolater. In the parlance of the Torah, you're engaging in idolatry because you're subordinate to a pagan culture. And of course, one cannot help but add the comment of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and others. I think he may have been the first. Eitz, the oven, wood, and stone alludes to those nations that venerate the wood and that venerate the stone. Where obviously his reference is to the wood of the cross and the stone being the Kaaba stone in Mecca. And again, you're subordinate to an alien culture. And of course, it is in this vein that we appreciate this also is enunciated explicitly in the Gemara. And on some plane, the sources that we've seen until now are sources that predate the Gemara, because the Midrashei Halacha and the Tosefta are Tanaic literature. The Gemara cites this Tanura Banan. When the Gemara cites this Tanura Banan, Ein Yotzim Me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz ela im ken amdu se'atayim b'sela, of course, the reference is the Tosefta. Ein Yotzim Me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. You don't do it unless there is the severe situation in which you don't have the wherewithal to be able to acquire food. And again, the drasha appears there at length. Again, we don't have time to go through everything in detail. We'll merely note for our purposes the additional dimension that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi not only notes, but with which he begins. And this is the Mishnah in Keduvot, Hakol Ma'alim Eretz Yisrael Bein Hakol Motzi'in. And the elaboration that then follows in the Gemara after Hakom Alin Le'Tui Mai Le'Tui Abadim. We're going to the part that is germane for our purposes. Tanu Rabbanan. הוא אומר לעלות, והיא אומרת שלא לעלות, כופין אותה לעלות, ואם לאו תצא בלא כתובה. היא אומרת לעלות, והוא אומר שלא לעלות, כופין אותה לצאת, ואם לאו יוציא וייתן כתובה. Again, note the parity between the husband and the wife. Whichever party is recalcitrant in refusing to come on aliyah is the party that needs to be coerced to coming on aliyah, and if not, the sole financial encumbrance of the ensuing divorce is on that party. And likewise, in the opposite direction, if they are in Eretz Yisrael and one spouse wants to leave, he omeret latzet, והוא אומר שלא לצאת, כופין אותה שלא תצא, ואם לאו תצא בלא כתובה, הוא אומר לצאת, והיא אומרת שלא לצאת, כופין אותו שלא לצאת, ואם לאו יוציא וייתן כתובה. The spouse that wants to stay has the upper hand. The spouse who wants to leave is forced to stay, and if not, the sole financial encumbrance of the ensuing divorce is on the spouse that wants to leave. And of course, inevitably, what we appreciate is the central theme here is indeed the question of halachic priorities. And this really is the part that we need to consider most definitively. Again, in terms of Rabbi Yehuda citation, the Gemara in Ketubot, in the same daf, that is, also cites the Tosefta on L'Lama Yadu Adam Be'eretz Yisrael Afilu Be'ir Shel Rabba Obdei Kochabim. And if we ask ourselves, going back to the passage in Sefer HaKuzari, so why indeed does Rabbi Yehuda begin with what strikes us as a really grisly way of enunciating the priority of Eretz Yisrael? What are the malot of Eretz Yisrael? Grounds of divorce. What are the malot of Eretz Yisrael? Living in a pagan city. And why is it so important for him to enunciate it in these terms? Again, halachic priorities. Because after all, when one considers how sacred the bond of marriage is in Chazal, the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot, Daf Samach Bet Amud Bet and Samach Yomor Aleph, Kol Adam She'en Lo Isha, Shavri B'lo Simcha, B'lo Bracha, B'lo Tova, B'lo Torah, B'lo Choma, B'lo Shalom, even to the extent of Kol Adam She'en Lo Isha, Eino Adam. And similarly, the list that we encounter in the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, Kol She'en Lo Isha, Shavri B'lo Tova, B'lo Ezer, B'lo Simcha, B'lo Bracha, B'lo Kapara, B'lo Shalom, B'lo Chayim, Eino Adam Shalem. The extent to which you have all these statements really disparaging one who is unmarried. Of course, we know that the one who is really regarded as deficient by not having a spouse is the man, not the woman. There's a woman evidently would be okay without having a husband, but the husband isn't okay without having a wife. But all of these statements disparaging the bachelor, the one who doesn't seek to be married, and moreover, in particular with respect to having established that bond, maintaining the fidelity of the marital bond, the Gemara in Masechet Sotah, Ish v'Isha zachu shchina beinehem, lo zachu eish ochalatan. That when a husband and wife are meritorious, then God's presence is with them, and if not, they are consumed by fire. That is, as Rashi notes, the implication being that the Ish contributes the Yud and the Isha, the Hey, and that, of course, is God's holy name. Whereas if God's presence isn't there, then all you have left is Eish and Eish. So they consume themselves in the fire of their lack of being worthy. And the thrust of the Midrash, the sanctity of the marital bond being a priority of Shalom Bayit. And moreover, the last lines of Masechet Gitin, Kol HaMegaresh Ishto Rishona Afilu Mizbeach Morid Alav Demaot. That when a husband and wife, their first spouses, when that divorce takes place, then the Mizbeach, as it were, is shedding tears. The altar is shedding tears over the loss of that marriage. So you have a sense about the sanctity of the marital bond is. It's not something that we relate to as trivial or inconsequential. and Eretz Yisrael takes precedence. If you ask me conceptually, why indeed does Eretz Yisrael take precedence over something as sacred as the marital bond? So I'll express it by way of analogy, if you will. We'll do almost anything to establish a compromise that will keep a marriage intact. What if one spouse says, I want to keep Shabbos, and the other spouse says, I absolutely want to be Mechal Shabbos? What are you going to do? You're going to say, keep every other Shabbos? And every other Shabbos be Mechal Shabbos? If there is no way of maintaining fidelity to Torah in the domestic bond that has been established, then you can't sustain that bond. Eretz Yisrael is of the same sort. One spouse wants to live in Eretz Yisrael, the other doesn't. That's not a prat. That's not some cursory detail. That is the essence of living according to the Torah. And as a result, it's grounds for divorce. And of course, in a similar vein, we appreciate the priority of living in a Makom Torah. That is, first, the Mishnah in the fourth parak of Avot, Rabbi Nehorai Omer, Heve Golelim Kom Torah. Exile yourself to a place of God, to be in a place of Torah. And at far greater length, with far greater elaboration, the Baraita in the sixth parak of Avot, the Baraita of Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, of the guy who says to him, are you prepared to live with us in our place, which isn't going to be a place of Torah, and I'll give you a fortune. And parenthetically, I know we all ask, being so profoundly attuned to the importance of outreach, is why doesn't he go there in order to make them all from that? And a number of commentators make this observation. It's shetadur imanu bimkomenu. We're not looking for outreach. We want you to come down to our level. With us in our place. So with us in our place, Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma says, I don't care if you give me all the riches in the world. I'm not coming. The significance, the centrality of living in a place of Torah. And again, in that context, appreciating just how profound the statement in the Tosefta, in the Gemara is, in telling you that Eretz Yisrael takes precedence over living in a place of Torah. Because it's Torah and HaKuzari, it's not really Torah. There's something that is so fundamentally flawed, better to be in a pagan city in Eretz Yisrael. No, we don't even have pagan cities in Eretz Yisrael. If you live in an Arab village in Eretz Yisrael, it's still not Avodah Zarah. The gamut of the Rishonim rule that Islam is not considered to be paganism. I don't know, maybe we can argue with some of the aberrations of Islam that have taken place in our generation. Things may have changed, but nonetheless, we appreciate the extent to which Eretz Yisrael takes precedence over what we would otherwise regard as a central principle for how to live according to the Torah. And this is really the critical message for us to appreciate. There are a number of poems that Rabbi Yudali wrote that I would have spent more time talking about, but given the hour, we're not going to. But the extent to which, for Rabbi Yehuda Levi, indeed, Eretz Yisrael is first and foremost something that we can quantify as a halachic priority. That's not all that Eretz Yisrael is. Again, the poetry was all about that. We don't have time to discuss that right now. I certainly urge you to take a look at those poems afterward. Both the liturgical poem, the first poem on the list, is a slicha, a piyut. The other poems are not liturgical, and that's why they're even more profound. Because in a liturgical poem, you have to talk about holy things. And when Rabbi Dalik talks about the significance of Yisrael, it is a visceral, emotional statement that isn't even something that can be quantified in terms of the strict halachic parameters of Kedusha. But the Kedusha, in terms of the strict halachic parameters, is critical because it tells us what priority Eretz Yisrael is going to have. And indeed, it is in this vein that we could discuss the other Rishonim. I don't know, in terms of the time, maybe we'll have to put this on the side for a different occasion, because I realize the hour is late. But at least as a Mareh Mechamot, Ramban, both in his parish on the Torah, the parish in Parashat Mas'eh, where he understands the thrust of V'rashem et ha'aretz v'yishavtem ba, כי לכן לתת את הארץ, לרשת אותה במדבר, מניינם, פרק ל"ג, פסוק נ"ג. So far as Rambam is concerned, this is not a temporary mitzvah given to Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar, but rather this is a positive mitzvah for all generations. And he enunciates the same idea at greater length when he critiques Rambam for not reckoning Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 commandments of the Torah. But simultaneously, we'll note that while Rambam doesn't reckon Yeshivat Yisrael as one of the 613 commandments of the Torah, all the halachot that pertain to the priorities of being in Eretz Yisrael, including what we just discussed, are here in Rambam as well. That is the thrust of, on the last page, in Hilchot Ishut, precisely telling you that if one spouse wants to go up to Eretz Yisrael, then you force the other to go as well, and otherwise the financial encumbrances of the divorce are on the account of the spouse, and so too in the opposite direction. And likewise in Hilchot Melachim, where Rambam explicitly cites the thrust of what we saw in the Gemara and the Tosefta regarding the priority of being in Eretz Yisrael and not leaving except under great duress, and even then, the exemplar of Elimelech and Machlon v'Chilyon ve'af al pi shemutar latzet eina midat chasidut. The importance always of remaining in Eretz Yisrael, and לעולם ידוע האדם בארץ ישראל אפילו בעיר שרובה בדיקה רבים ומזלות ידעו בחוץ לארץ אפילו בעיר שרובה ישראל. The priority of living in Eretz Yisrael, even in a pagan place, as opposed to living in Chutz La'aretz, even in an entirely Jewish area. Why? Again, that there is no greater sundering of one's bond, one's bond to Avodat Hashem, than being outside of Eretz Yisrael. So, when we consider in this vein what Rabbi Yehuda Levi has established as the opening volley in Ma'alot Eretz Yisrael, it seems so unseemly to talk about Eretz Yisrael in terms of grounds for divorce, in terms of where you should be choosing to live, but really, isn't that the most profound statement as halachic man where your priorities lie? And that, more than anything else, is where Rabbi Yehuda Levi begins the discussion. It doesn't end here. Ultimately, arguably, one could say that the discussion of the ontological significance of Eretz Yisrael begins long before this passage, when Rabbi Yehuda Levi indeed begins the discussion of the centrality of Eretz Yisrael in the second treatise of Sefer HaKuzari. But you want to know the ma'alot of Eretz Yisrael? First, enunciate those ma'alot in a halachic context. Don't just say something is valuable. Just tell me how valuable it is compared with other values that are also values in Torah, in halacha. And it's in that vein that we appreciate just what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is enunciating at the beginning of this passage. Have we exhausted it? We haven't exhausted it. I think we've exhausted our time, so I think we'll need to conclude here. But I certainly hope we can have a longer discussion of this at some other opportunity.
Thank you.
Presumably, if you look at the Yehuda Levi within the context when it was written, so then the people who presumably that he didn't write the Kuzari for the Kuzari, he wrote it for the intended audience, which was
of course.
Jews,
he didn't know any Kuzarim.
Sure. So it was intended for the people who he was writing it for.
So yeah,
there were no cities in Eretz Yisrael. Like today, there's obviously a whole different situation. But in those days, there would have been lots of hitnadut to go to Eretz Yisrael because there would be no city which was, Kli Yisrael. So it was vitally important for him to mention these.
That certainly is true. Just to add one additional dimension, let's the recording as well. Just to add one additional dimension with respect to indeed what Rabbi Yehuda Levi's agenda is, and this is something, of course, that really warrants a whole separate discussion. But what becomes manifestly clear, both in Sefer HaKuzari and in Rabbi Yehuda Levi's poetry with respect to Eretz Yisrael, is while I reiterate, Rabbi Yehuda Levi deemed Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael to be a mitzvah chiyuvit l'chol davar ve'inyan, there's also an additional dimension that we need to appreciate in the way he relates to the return to Eretz Yisrael. And on a personal plane, we should appreciate this is evidently manifest in his life story, because what emerged from the correspondence of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the correspondence of the employee of his patron, of Rabbi Chafon Halevi, Abu Natzer, in Alexandria, is evidently his agenda was not merely coming on a personal pilgrimage. He was intent upon moving his entire family to Eretz Yisrael. But not just his entire family. He was intent upon getting Am Yisrael, to express it in the words of one of his piyutim, Hityatzvi lashuv le'eretz hatzvi. To have Am Yisrael return in mass to Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has a concept of a native wisdom, Hebraic culture that had largely been eroded and lost because we had been away from Eretz Yisrael and away from autonomy for such an extended period of time. And his vision of Eretz Yisrael is a place where that's going to be reestablished, where Am Yisrael will be restored to what Am Yisrael was intended to be a beacon for the world, precisely by virtue of being in the place that God had designated for it. So, of course, there's a halachic dimension. It's not by any means the entire picture. Ultimately, more than the strict parameters, there is the realization that Eretz Yisrael is the critical prerequisite, as he expresses it in the most forceful of terms several simanim earlier, regarding the utmost fruit that Am Yisrael is supposed to be producing as nevuah, and nevuah doesn't happen if it's not connected to Eretz Yisrael. But of course, again, talking about ma'alot Eretz Yisrael, the first place to start is halacha, because halacha establishes priorities.
And also sets him up at the end when the king says no.
Indeed. What do you mean?
When the king says, "What about you?"
That's the next thing, man.
Yeah, no, I'm saying.
But
when he says, "Yeah, you're right, I had to go," I mean,
the end of the book is where it's ironic, where the chaver says he's leaving and the king wants to hold him back. And that's a completely additional dimension in appreciating the role of Eretz Yisrael for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's thought, and of course, likewise, for his autobiography. Because for roughly 850 years, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's life ended the same way as Sefer HaKuzari, a departure and no conclusion. Because no one ever knew if he made it here. It's only thanks to documents that have come to light over the course of the last half century from the Cairo Geniza that we can establish pretty much unequivocally that he made it here, which is a profound consolation for me personally as a Talmud, to know that the culmination of his life was in fact on some level achieved.
Why would he go on a chag?
What?
Why would he leave on a chag?
No, he wasn't. So I should explain. He wasn't leaving on the chag. He had boarded the in a different kind of sense. I could say in a way he did. He boarded the boat on Kaf Chet Iyar, the ship that would take him to Yerushalayim. He boarded on Yom Yerushalayim. But the problem was, in those days, the only thing that powered ships was the wind, and the winds weren't favorable. So all of the ships that were in the harbor in Alexandria that were sailing west left the harbor, and his ship was stranded, which in a sense was providential, because on the fourth day that he was sitting aboard the ship, and it was common in those days, as the ship was sitting in the harbor, for people to go from the pier out to the ship and back. On the fourth day, 2 letters arrived from a traveler from Spain that were addressed to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi.
Oh.
And Rabbi Chalfon Halevi, attendant, Abu Natzer's name. Abu Natzer doesn't sound like a Jewish name, but he was Jewish. Clearly he was Jewish. Abu Natzer brings these letters to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And of course, the problem is trying to figure out from cursory references what exactly he's describing. And one of these letters was from a Yehuda ibn Ezra. Who was Yehuda ibn Ezra? And the thrust of the letter was, he can't wait anymore and he's leaving. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was manifestly distraught over this letter and gave Abu Natzer a very expensive hat, turban to hold on to, with instructions that if Yehuda comes within the year, to sell it and provide him with funds for coming to him in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, as you can probably surmise, the consensus of contemporary scholars is Yehuda ibn Ezra is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's grandson. There had been earlier sources, indeed quoted even by the Abarbanel, that Rabbi Avabi ibn Ezra was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's son-in-law. That appears not to have been the case. Rather, they were mechutanim. This is not definite, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that Rabbi Avabi ibn Ezra's son Yitzchak was married to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's daughter. And sorry, and therefore Ibn Ezra was not a father's name. It was a patronymic. It's a title. The family name was Ibn Ezra. Rabbi Ibn Ezra's father's name was Meir. No, Ibn Ezra, again, it's a surname. Ashkenazim didn't have surnames until the 19th century. Sephardim had surnames in the time of the Rishonim. So Ibn Ezra was, because whoever was the family patriarch at some point was called Ezra. In any case, Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra's son's name was Yitzchak, but the family's name was Ibn Ezra. In keeping with Sephardi practice, the grandson was named for the grandfather. So, and indeed, there are a couple of poems that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote prior to leaving for Eretz Yisrael, in which he refers to how traumatic it is. These two poems actually are in the source sheet, when he describes how traumatic it is to be leaving Yehuda. So Yehuda is on his way. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had evidently arranged that the whole family was going to be coming, but things were delayed. The ship to go. I don't want to get carried away going into all the sundry details. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's ship arrived in Alexandria only 5 days before Rosh Hashanah. Evidently, it was not supposed to have come that late in the sailing season, because it was 5 days before Rosh Hashanah. It was impossible for him to continue on to Eretz Yisrael immediately, and then came the winter, and he was stranded in Egypt for the whole winter. There may have been an attempt to come to Eretz Yisrael over land that failed, and he's only leaving for Eretz Yisrael almost a year later. So Yehuda, who thought he would already be rejoining his grandfather, was impatient to leave. There's more to this story. There are also certain complexities with respect to Yitzchak, but we'll leave that for a different occasion. Should we have a song maybe? No? Huh? Tzaholi varone, Yoshev Etzion. Tzaholi varone, Yoshev Etzion. Ki gadol bekirbech, Kedosh Yisra'el. Ki gadol bekirbech, Kedosh Yisra'el. Tzalei Baroni Yoshev Etzion. Tzalei Baroni Yoshev Etzion. Ay, ay, ki gadol b'kirbech Kedosh Yisra'el. Ki gadol b'kirbech Kedosh Yisra'el. Does anyone here on Zoom have anything to say? I hope you folks. I mean, I see your boxes. I don't see any videos going. Okay. Okay. Halavai sheniskeli b'sharot tovot yeshuot nachamot v'sheniskeli geula shlema b'meira v'yameinu.
Well, you did believe that there was a conversion.
Sorry?
You did believe that there was a mass conversion.
Definitely, but I don't think anyone disputes the fact that there was a conversion. The question is how mass it was. Was it just the aristocracy, or did it actually spread through the rank and file? And he doesn't answer that question either. I mean, he was basing himself upon the legend of the Khazars, which in his time was really little more than a legend. Indeed, he cast Sefer HaKuzari as four. There are artifacts. Unfortunately, the area that was the hub of the empire is currently at the bottom of some dam that was built by the Soviets, which may indeed have had some economic benefit, but also may have reflected the Russian aversion to admitting that the first civilization that existed in their country was Jewish. It wasn't popular among the Russians to talk about the Khazars.
Well, they weren't Russians anyway.
But they lived in that area. The Khazar Empire extended in its zenith as far west as Kiev.
That's pretty much.
Yeah, it was focused between the Black and Caspian Seas, but extended as far west as Kiev. And we know that the king of the Khazars had to be Jewish for an extended period of time. That was on the books.
I just want to thank you.
I got a chance to look at the poetry as well.
This is face to face for the first time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized.
Yeah, I
Oh,
go on the Zoom.
thank you.
Right now, I am very compromised. My Zoom is not, I have it on my tablet, and my tablet has no space for it. So I can't get it. So.
I hope
We're gonna work out getting her on.
Okay, thank you.
We'll get her.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So anyway, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll say thank Hashem for bringing you right in my neighborhood.
It's wonderful for me to go in person.
Yeah, I live on Alexander.
Sorry?
Nahal Alexander, which is
okay.
right off Shimshon.
You know what? I mean, every 4 weeks or so.
I know, and Friday night, I don't go anywhere.
I understand. Okay.
And Shabbos afternoon.
No, Shabbos afternoon is a problem because they feel it's in the main shul, and unfortunately, it's not as I would have preferred, open to women as well.
So this was a real bonus.
Okay, well,
Thank you so much.
okay. It's a pleasure to see you in person.
Yeah, and
Ironically, we saw your Mechutanim's brother and sister-in-law today. That is, we were Moshe and Rachel
Oh,
Saperstein.
you were there?
Yeah.
Oh, so nice.
So.
Very
So.
nice. Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh,
Okay,
that's
so.
great.
I have to get my daughter home.
Okay, thank you.
This is way past my bedtime.
Okay,
I mean,
thank you very much for coming on. Yeah, I have to. No, I have to admit, like, it took me a moment because switching from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, my daughter has,
Best regards to Yisra'el.
my daughter learns like at the crack of dawn.
I'm a morning person, not a night.
Oh, it's okay, sorry. And especially the half hour that took me to get this thing right up and running.
It's worth it. It's good. It's
Thank
worth it. I'm glad I came.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So that's okay.
Amen. Okay, that's all.
And you are a wonderful person. I mean, you know,
Unless anyone has anything else to say, I'm going to end the session now. Okay. Okay.
This is kind of very, very pointless question, but the